I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings. Is there a hidden holographic biological energetic matrix of information that fundamentally underlies life as we know it? Does life begin as a quantum blueprint that exists before any matter is involved? Are there scientists who have actually proven that this underlying information of bioenergetics can be used to regrow organs in the body that had been otherwise destroyed, such as the pancreas? And with the full implications of this knowledge, do we see any structures on the cosmic level that might indicate something like the DNA helix? Could there be patterns similar to DNA on the cosmic scale showing that this is truly a fractal holographic phenomenon where the same fields that make DNA out of non-living energetic material could make similar structures on much larger scales? These are the exciting questions that we're going to explore in this week's episode. We've looked deeply at the work of Dr. Peter Garyaev in previous episodes, and now we're going in on a deeper level than we ever have before. Garyaev has a theory of what he calls supergenes, which he likens to DNA videotapes, as if this information exists as a quantum blueprint that is in dynamic interaction with the DNA molecule at all times. So instead of seeing that 98% so-called junk DNA as being useless and unimportant, Garyaev is looking at this as the antenna for some sort of bioenergetic field that interfaces directly with life. The implications for this are absolutely huge. We did talk about some of Garyaev's discoveries in previous episodes, but I want to bring that back now because he has done a lot more than just the discoveries we're talking about right now. He worked in conjunction with another scientist named Poponin, and Garyaev was one of the key contributors, one of the two main contributors to that study of the so-called DNA phantom effect. And this again is so significant because years of meditating on how this could have happened led to the model that we're now discussing. Dr. Garyaev put a piece of DNA inside a little tiny room that counts where all the light goes. And it can see each individual photon, where it is in that three-dimensional space, and makes a dot on a graph. Well, they did not expect to see this happening, but what happened was that when they put DNA into that room, all the random distribution of light went away, and the light all started to travel through the DNA molecule itself. Now, this is very, very bizarre because it suggests a quantum gravitational pull. But wait a minute, light should not be influenced by a tiny little DNA molecule enough that it can get pulled like it was a black hole. Black holes are very large, planets have gravity, but the idea of microgravity at this small of a scale is mind-boggling. The idea that light could be captured and pulled by a DNA molecule. Remember, photons are very tiny, and compared to the size of the photon, the room that this DNA was in is huge. So this light is actually moving across very large amounts of space. And remember, the other thing that's so weird about the DNA phantom effect is not only do you have photons moving gravitational pull-wise, the equivalent of what would be many, many miles if we were the size of a photon. The magic was what happened when you took the DNA out of the room. The light continued to stay in the place where the DNA had been, and this lasted not 1 day, not 5 days, not 10 days, I feel like an auctioneer now, fully 30 days long. This quantum blueprint is still absorbing the light, but there's no DNA there to do that. So that is the beginning of what led Garyaev to study bioenergetics to get this model of a supergene continuum. The idea of a fractal structure that exists at the quantum level in which DNA is co-participating with some kind of energy. What the heck is doing that? How does the DNA have the ability to structure the space it was in so the gravity is still there, even if the DNA wasn't. To me, it shows that DNA is emanating from a wave. And even if you take the DNA away, the wave still is hanging out there. It still has gravitational pull. And if the right materials are around, it's going to pull back together another DNA molecule. Well, there you have it. That's what's happening in the Montagnier study we talked about in previous episodes. That's where this Nobel Prize-winning biologist generated DNA out of plain water. He got regular water molecules to form into DNA just by having other DNA nearby and zapping it with a 7 hertz electrical current. Holy crap, that's really interesting, because now we're looking at the underlying template of this gravitational attraction that wants to take things from its environment for 30 days after the DNA is gone. It's still grabbing light and pulling it in. But we only measured light in that room. We didn't see what would happen if you had other things in the room. But we have seen that with Dr. Sergei Laikin, as I said in previous episodes, where he actually took pieces of DNA and found that the like DNA attracted to itself over vast distances. So I'm saying not only is DNA going to attract other DNA, but in the case of Montagnier's water, it's taking the actual molecules of the water and it's fundamentally retooling them and regrowing them. So we talked about Geryaev also in light of his correlation with the work of Dr. Jeffrey Delro, who discovered that the actual organization of nucleotides in DNA has a fractal holographic pattern to it, and that it's basically almost identical to how our speech is organized. And this kind of makes sense, right? If we are ultimately made of a code, a DNA code, then that code iterates itself into how we speak. We are an embodiment of the code that makes us. So our speech patterns and our DNA patterns are nearly identical. They have the same underlying fractal structures. And that's what's so cool, is how this applies to health. And we saw Geryaev actually regrow the teeth in a woman's mouth who had lost all of her teeth, tragically losing his tenure at a major Moscow hospital because they simply couldn't believe that what he had discovered was true. So let's read a little bit of his quote again to get back into this, and then we're going to go into the new information that's so stunning. He said, programs exist in the form of DNA videotapes which are used by the genetic apparatus acting like a computer, accessing a program. Unfortunately, these videotapes contain healthy organisms, but they get corrupted over time and lead to DNA mutations, which he believes is the source of aging and disease. So the code is pure at its heart, and then it's just the mutations over time that lead to it degrading. The instructions accumulate errors, the organism gets sick, grows old, and dies. It is very likely that these DNA videotapes can be renewed and corrected. With this new understanding of how our genetic apparatus works, we can have completely new technologies for healing a person and extending their life. So here again was the very bizarre picture of the teeth, where you see 4 more molars that did not exist before. They're all new, and sad that he got fired, but this is where we get into the new stuff. Regrowing the pancreas in rats. Now, there's some important groundwork that needs to be laid here. First of all, what is diabetes? Diabetes is caused by a lack of insulin in the bloodstream. So what does insulin do? Insulin regulates your blood sugar. If you get low blood sugar, that means you haven't had enough sugar in your diet. That's where you start to get lightheaded, you start to get woozy, and it can be very deadly, actually, if your blood sugar drops too low. By the same token, if your blood sugar gets too high, it's very, very dangerous, because that sugar can crowd out things like oxygen that you need to survive, and death can happen very quickly. If your blood sugar gets too high, your whole body becomes toxic, you can't heal from diseases. A lot of diabetics start to have neuropathy, which is actually that the nerves in their body begin to shut down. They start to lose feeling and even the ability to move in their hands and feet. So diabetes is nasty. If your blood sugar gets too high, your cells literally start to rot, and you just will die in a very awful way. So what regulates how much sugar you have in your blood is this chemical called insulin. And so, as you probably know, diabetics have to inject themselves with a syringe that has insulin in it. And that insulin is what regulates their blood sugar. So they're also told to not eat too much sugar. My grandmother on my father's side was diabetic. And so she was always very careful about sugar. She couldn't eat too much of anything that was sweet. And she always had her diabetic candies and her diabetic cookies and stuff. So the idea is that if you are injecting your insulin, you need to inject the right amount to be able to regulate your blood sugar level. So Nana, as we called her, my grandmother, always had to take these little blood tests. And you stick your finger with a needle and you see what your blood sugar is, and that controls how much insulin you're supposed to take. Well, why can't your body do this by itself? Well, it's supposed to, but it breaks down. So how do you get insulin? Insulin is manufactured by a specific organ in your body that sits next to the liver, and it's called the pancreas. The pancreas's job is to make insulin. And what happens is that somebody with diabetes has had way too much sugar. This is usually what causes it, is overconsumption of sugar. And your pancreas gets overwhelmed and it actually dies of fatigue. And so a person with advanced diabetes literally does not have a pancreas. There might be a little bit of it left, but it's mostly gone. So without your pancreas, you can't make insulin. And without insulin, your blood sugar is going to skyrocket. And if you don't get shots of insulin, then you will get very advanced diabetes very quickly and you will die from it. This is what, again, causes gangrene in the limbs. It's really horrible. So what if there was a way to stop all this madness? What if there was a way to cure this horrible disease? That is what Geryaev has actually done. Now, it's important to note here that as far as I am aware, this treatment has not yet been applied to human beings. But it can be applied to human beings because the test subjects that he used in the animal kingdom are used for human medications all the time. He did it with rats. There's enough similarity between rat DNA and human DNA that if something works on rats, it's probably going to work on us as well. It's very likely. So the awesome implications of this are that my wife's cousin's father didn't have to die. My grandmother didn't have to die. All the people with diabetes could actually have a complete healing using this amazing science. And in fact, the deeper we go into this alternative science, we find out that all diseases can be cured. Cancer, diabetes, you name it. The energetic component, by repairing the damage in the wave itself, can totally turn around your health. So let's dive into this now and see exactly what Geryaev was doing here. This is from his paper now. I'm just reading you from the paper. 3 series of experiments with identical protocols were conducted by the groups of Geryaev in 2000 in Moscow, Russia, then again in 2001 in Toronto, Canada, and then in 2005 in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia. So this is important because what we're seeing here is that he is getting replication. We're not having an experiment that's only done once. This utterly groundbreaking experiment was done 3 different times in 3 different cities. And again, this knowledge is being suppressed, and it's being suppressed, I believe, for political reasons, because the only thing that makes more money on Earth than oil is pharmaceuticals. And ultimately, if you get better, there's no profit motive. So they want you sick. They want to keep diabetics on insulin and keep them on treatments and therapies because there is, sadly, a part of our world that wants to depopulate, wants to reduce population, and they don't like people getting healthy. Diabetes is totally curable. That's what these 3 experiments in Moscow, in Toronto, and Nizhny Novgorod proved. It's really amazing. The goal of the experiments was to test new technology for regenerating a damaged pancreas, which is what causes diabetes. A control group of rats was injected with a lethal dose of a poison called alloxan, which destroys the pancreas, the hormone responsible for insulin production in an organism. Now, this is just an aside, but you'll notice that there are certain words missing in the text. I did not add them in. This is one of the problems of getting a Russian to English translation is it's not always going to be perfect. So I just left it the way it was, and I'm just going to ad-lib the words in that are missing or correct certain things if they're wrong. But the point here is that there's this very nasty toxin called alloxan, and he was injecting rats with this toxin. And what it does is it totally overloads and destroys their pancreas, literally leaving them with no pancreas. Now let's keep reading. As a result of this injection, this toxic injection, all of the rats in the control group, which is the group that gets injected and doesn't have the actual treatment, all of the rats in the control group developed type 1 diabetes, which means that their blood sugar goes to a very high level, and they were all dead within 4 to 6 days. So this is how toxic that injection is. One injection totally wipes out the pancreas, leads to a skyrocketing blood sugar level. The diabetes is so advanced and so rapid that every one of these rats dies within 4 to 6 days. That's very important. This is not something that drags out over many years or even a series of months. It's a huge lethal dose of poison that causes death in as little as 4 days and as long, but no longer, than 6 days. It's within this construct, where the control group again does not get any therapy, that he was able to apply this miracle cure that turned around the health of these rats, leading to a dramatic healing. Let's see what happens. Then the same lethal dose of Alexan was injected into another group of rats. And when the rats in the second group reached the critical condition, meaning that they are literally about to die, they're at that point where their health is literally on the brink of death. Only when they were right on the brink of death were they then exposed to what he's calling healing wave information. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the healing wave information ties in with his theory of supergenes. So here's the guy that sees DNA attracting light into itself, and then you take the DNA away, and the light is still held in place by a mysterious force field that he calls a DNA phantom. And then he comes up with this idea that there's supergenes, that there's some greater genetic code that's all around us that doesn't actually require physical matter to exist. It's a quantum blueprint. And that quantum blueprint knows how to heal you. It has the codes for healing you properly. So when we were talking